Hello there, Dr. Driver here. Okay, I'm going to talk to you now about Kieckhefer chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 has to do with the twilight of paganism, magic in Norse and Icelandic culture. By the way, I will also be interjecting some of my own comments here. First, it's really interesting to note that ideas about magic and also of the reality of fairies persisted in Iceland right up until the mid-20th century. This is from me, not Kieckhefer, when magic was driven out of Iceland by technology. So that's interesting. There's similar ideas, actually. 19th century England seemed to be full of fairies or fairy sightings, but by the 20th century, technology had driven them all away. Kieckhefer notes that most of our information comes after the Christian conversion, and our fullest sources are fictional accounts that combine actual magical practice with fanciful embellishments. So what we know about magic, early magic, mostly comes from fictional writing. And of course, we know fictional writing is often not true. So it's difficult to recover actual ancient practice except through fiction that survives, and also through surviving artifacts. And that's me, not Kieckhefer. What we see with Christian conversion is the appropriation of pagan holy sites and temples as well as festivals. Christmas, for example. When was Jesus born? His birth date is not in the Bible. Christmas is a version of, or takes over, the winter solstice festivals, the Saturnalia festivals, the pagan festivals that were held around that time of year, often with similar traditions like gift giving, for example. Kieckhefer notes that Gregory the Great told his missionaries to England that they should not demolish pagan temples, but reconsecrate them and use them as Christian churches. They should endow pagan festivals with Christian meaning, rather than prohibiting their observance. So too, the missionaries incorporated elements of what we were calling magic into this new cultural synthesis. So holy sites, holy pagan sites were taken over for churches. You see this actually also in Europe. Holidays were also appropriated by the church and made Christian. And this is me, this is not Kieckhefer. I'm going to talk to you briefly here, take a sidetrack, about the straw goat. Now, this is the Yule goat. The straw goat one sees in Scandinavian Christmas festivities is a pagan symbol, as of course is the Christmas tree. Christmas tree has to do with the coming again of spring on the shortest day of the year, that kind of reminder that spring will come again. Getting back to the goat. According to Norse legend, the god Thor rode the sky in a chariot drawn by two goats. The last sheaf of grain from the harvest was credited with magical properties and saved for the Yule celebration, called the Julebakken, which means Yule goat. Christians later adopted the goat as a Christmas symbol, and the Yule goat is thought, in Scandinavia anyway, to travel along with St. Nicholas, giving out presents. So as St. Nick is going around, he's got a cart here, as you see, with a goat. This is from a Swedish illustrator, Jenny Nostrom, it looks like. And young men in Scandinavia disguise themselves as Yule goats, which is kind of hard to imagine, singing songs, performing tricks, and demanding gifts. A prank is to put a small straw Yule goat into a neighbor's house without her knowing, and then she comes across it and wonders how it got there. The straw Yule goat still symbolizes Christmas in Scandinavia, and some cities erect large versions of the goat, as we saw just now, to place in town squares and malls. Okay, back to Kieckhefer. Monks and other churchmen usually drew the line at explicit veneration of the old gods, and they forbade practices that might be construed as involving such veneration. An anonymous preacher in the early Middle Ages protested, quote, all those who believe they can prevent hail by means of inscribed lead tablets or charmed horns are no Christians, but rather pagans. Following early Christian writers, they identified the traditional gods as demons, and thus all magic that called on the services of these gods, explicitly or implicitly, was demonic magic. However, we will see those lines are hard to draw. The traditional cultures of Northern Europe, like those of the Roman Empire, linked religion and magic without distinction. In Germanic mythology, for example, the god Woden or Odin was himself a master of magic who had gained power over the magical runic alphabet and could use its characters to perform wondrous deeds. Runic writing was used first for magical inscriptions, then other kinds of writing, including Christian prayers. The runic inscriptions of the Norse culture appeared in Scandinavia and Iceland, gained a strong foothold in England, and made their mark on other parts of Europe through trade and looting. Even writing itself, or drawing sounds, was considered magical. And I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. This is a film based on Beowulf, which stars Antonio Banderas as Ibn Fadlan, who's a 10th century chronicler. He's an Arab who is sent to meet with the Northmen, and he writes a very powerful historical account of this. And the film draws on the Rizala, which is what this book's called, quite heavily. In the movie, Ibn Fadlan, who's played by Antonio Banderas, teaches Bulvai, who's the main character, how to draw sounds, how to write words, which is seen as important and valuable in this film. And I think it was thought to be important and valuable among Viking and Anglo-Saxon people. Kieckhefer mentions the story told by the English chronicler Bede, who lived in the late 7th, early 8th century, of a Northumbrian captive whose brother, thinking him dead, had masses said for his soul. These prayers magically loosened his brother's chains and set him free. The captors, not understanding why this happened, immediately asked if he was carrying magical writing on his person. For them, magic was bound up with writing. And we see Bede here, he's writing with his quill, and he's got his scraper, which is that large instrument you see him holding in his left hand. The scraper would be used just to erase errors as you went along when you were copying with your quill and ink. The earliest runes date from the 3rd century. They were developed and retained by Norsemen well into the medieval era, and indeed, some letters live on in English right up until through the 18th century. Particularly the Thorn letter, which is a TH, which opens up to become a Y. But we should talk about that in class. So we read in the Norse stories about people who used runic inscriptions to work various types of magic, to gain victory in battle, to detect poison and split open a drinking horn that contains a poison drink, to ensure fertility, to procure love, to affect the weather, whatever you wanted to control, you would use runes for. One source speaks of the runes having power even to revive the corpse of a hanged man. So there we kind of go over the line to necromancy, the raising of the dead. There are many early medieval objects with runic inscriptions in Scandinavia, Iceland, and England. I think you also see some examples in Ireland and Scotland. These inscriptions are often associated with burial sites as protective amulets on gravestones. So these are either to ward off evil spirits or possibly to bind the soul of the dead to the grave. There's another one. Kieckhefer then talks about Grettir's saga. The Norse sagas have to do with the adventures of men and women, and there certainly were women warriors in the Norse sagas. And indeed, there was a fairly recent finding that great Viking funeral archaeological finding of this great burial mound that they thought was to a major male Viking warrior. They did DNA testing on the skeleton of the bones, and they found that she was a woman. So interesting. Anyway, in Grettir's saga, there's a lady magician. There's a specialist who uses ceremonies and magically charged objects, but her main power is the spoken and written word, the spells she chants over the tree trunk, and the runic inscription she carves on it. Others in her society find magic reprehensible, not because it's violent, but because it's fair, and it's also performed in secret. So you're supposed to kill your enemies directly. You're not supposed to secretly, magically do them in. He then also talks about the Scandinavian Eddas. The Eddas, as opposed to the sagas are about people, and the Eddas are about the gods. So, yes, the Eddas also talk about magic, but gods performing magic. Okay, then he moves to Irish literature, has a lot of emphasis on the she. This looks like Sidhe, doesn't it? But it's she in Gaelic. This is a race of immortals. And sometimes they're also identified with fairies, with very powerful fairies, which in Ireland were large and rather fearsome. But the word is pronounced she. Though I kind of like pronouncing it as Sith. It's not correct, but I like it. Because it sort of looks like Sith also to me. D can be TH in Irish. And then he tells the story of Conley, the red-haired, who hears the voice of a fairy queen who invites him to join her in the fairy hill, where there are everlasting feasts, no cares, and no death. Fearing her enchantment, Conley obtains from a druid a musical charm so he can ward off her allurement. She goes away for a while, but she gives him an apple on which he's able to kind of eat he eats the apple for a year a month. And then she returns, warns Conley against demonic power, and prophesies the coming of St. Patrick to convert the Irish. So weirdly pagan and Christian imagery here. Then she beckons Conley to come away with her on a magic boat, and he goes away with her and, of course, is never seen again. In the Germanic and Celtic traditions, Christian critics believed that magic was linked to pagan worship and thus veneration of demons, simply because this magic was rooted in the same pre-Christian culture that had fostered veneration of the old gods. Here's a hill. This is a burial mound, probably. It's called a fairy hill, though, in Ireland. Maybe similar to the fairy hill where Conley goes off with the fairy queen. These tend to be burial mounds, which may have been robbed previously by grave robbers, but they tend to be that. And Ireland is full of these things. They're quite interesting. Also, I'm just going to riff a little bit. This is away from Kieckhefer again. This is Dr. D. Pagan belief is still rooted in the names of our weekdays. Monday is Moon Day. Tuesday refers to Tu, who's the war god. Wednesday is Woden's Day. It's the anglicizing of Woden. Thursday, I think you can guess, is Thor, refers to Thor. Ragnarok. Friday is Frigg, who's a Norse fertility deity. She's a love goddess. Saturday, of course, refers to Saturn, planet Saturn. And Sunday, obvious. Okay, chapter 4, moving on to common traditions of medieval magic. Oh, we'll just continue to look at this fairy mound. Kieckhefer notes that while monks and monastic houses were healers, so were lay people. So monastic houses might run a hospital, for example. Lay people might bring sick people into their homes. And most societies have informal healers and diviners, recognized as such by their clients, but not certified. Okay. One of these is the Italian lady I've talked to you about before, Matuccia Francisci. She was the one who gave the mistress of the priest that formula for, I think she's supposed to boil the hoof of a mule or something and then drink it. So it's very revolting. Anyway, but taking on sympathetically the infertility of a mule, because of course mules don't reproduce. So she wouldn't get pregnant having this affair with the priest. Anyway, Matuccia Francisci has a number of cures. Sorry. Some of which are rather grotesque. You can read about them in Kieckhefer. I'm going to skip the one with the baby bone and move right to the curse. She knows how to counteract curse. There was a man who found a feather on his pillow, assumed he was cursed, took it to Matuccia, and Matuccia then destroyed the spell by means of an incantation, and then she told the man to take the feather home and burn it. But there are lots of her remedies if you look at Kieckhefer, some of which are really grotesque. He also mentions diviners and fortune tellers who might be clerical. That is, they're in the church, but they're still using magic, really, to prophesy, sometimes using even bibliomancy, using the Bible to prophesy, or lay fortune tellers. Then it kind of moves from that right to doctors, the medical profession. Universities begin to train medical doctors in the 12th century, but these were only men, with the exception, possibly, of the medical school, very famous in Salerno, Italy, where we know there were women healers. The Trotula, Dame Trot, who wrote Trotula, seems to have existed. There seem to have been women healers also, maybe not attending the school formally, but they were located in Salerno. I talked to you when I was talking to you about obstetrics and gynecology in the first lecture about the Trotula and how important it was as a medical book for women. Anyway, by the 1420s, English doctors wanted to prohibit, I'll just stay on doctors here. English doctors wanted to prohibit all practice of medicine by those without a formal university education. So physicians were university-educated men who practiced internal or general medicine. Surgeons were not held in as high esteem, and those were the people who cut into people. Surgery goes back. There's a wonderful manual written by Abulcasis. I think it's 9th or 10th century. Abulcasis was an Arab doctor. He wrote a very detailed description of performing surgery with drawings of the surgical instruments. And almost everything that's known about surgery in the West comes through him and through Arabic sources. Physicians also try to control the surgeons and the apothecaries. An apothecary is a pharmacist. And so the surgeons responded by setting up their own schools. So there's a rivalry quite early on in the healing field. And then there were barber surgeons who cut hair, pulled teeth, and bled people. So they were kind of generalists who did these rather lowly tasks, while a physician might focus on your diet, your horoscope. They might bleed you as well. Women also functioned as healers, though they were often unofficially recognized and sometimes even prosecuted in court. This is me again, just telling you that in the 14th century in Paris, we have records of women healers who are being tried for practicing medicine. There was a lady named Jacqueline Félicie de Allemagne. That means from Germany. De Allemagne is from Germany. And she was prosecuted by the medical faculty of the University of Paris in 1322. Jacqueline Félicie de Allemagne called many witnesses who testified to her healing power. She also said that women needed women doctors. They did not want to show parts of themselves to men. They needed women doctors to heal them and help them with childbirth and that sort of thing. But she was prohibited by the university from practicing, but apparently continued to do so anyway. Other women that we have on trial records in 14th century Paris are a lady named Joanna, who's described as a conversa. A conversa is usually someone Jewish who's been converted to Christianity, who is converted to Christianity, perhaps not necessarily of her own accord. Spain is full of conversos and conversa, who are people who had to convert when the Jews are cast from Spain, about the same time Columbus leaves on his voyage to America. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Another woman, Bellotta, is described as a Jewess on the court record. And there's also a lady named Margaret of Ypres who's described as a surgeon. I've lectured to you already about gynecological and obstetrical treatises, and I've talked to you about the Leech book from the 10th century and the Lachnunga from the 11th century in an earlier lecture. The Lachnunga, says Kieckhefer, is not a coherent medical treatise relying on magical formulas and claiming It claims that, this is Laknunga again, claims that an important source of all illness is malevolent elves. Oh, here's a woman healer. Oh, crap. Well, here she is. I should have gone to that slide. Here are the elves. Ooh. Laknunga, for example, gives you this recipe for a healing salve. It's made of butter from a completely red or white cow, to which 57 specified herbs are added. The mixture is stirred with a stick on which the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are inscribed in Latin. So I don't think these elves are necessarily all that malevolent, being sort of heroic in Lord of the Rings, but I thought this would be kind of amusing. All right, then there are recurring themes in magical charms, potions, and spells that Kieckhefer points to. One is to have a kind of ritual process when making a spell. Okay, so one should go out barefoot or in silence to pick an herb, or one should abstain from sexual contact before gathering herbs, or one should dig an herb from the ground without using an iron implement. He says this is because some of these formulas must go back to the pre-Iron Age. I think that's a bit of a stretch, personally. I don't know what that's about. Iron might have something to do with magnets. I'm not sure. I'm not going there. Okay, so the first one is you have to have a kind of specialized ritual for gathering the materials for your charm. The second is to consider sympathetic magic, how the powers given a plant or animal, like strength or speed or shape, might play into making a charm or a healing potion. And here's the mandrake again, which was thought to take on the shape of a man or woman and was used in fertility formulas to create babies. Odd. Sympathetic magic. A third point is to consider the effect of heavenly bodies on the making of the charm. So certain plants can cure lunacy, says Kieckhefer, if they are wrapped in a red cloth and tied around the lunatic's head under a specified astrological sign while the moon is waxing. One should go out before sunrise, for example, to pluck an herb. Fragments of bark are more potent if they come from the eastern side of the tree, where they can absorb the rays of the rising sun. Okay, the fourth item is the use of arcane or unknown language. Okay, so abracadabra, please and thank you. Abracadabra is one form of a word that doesn't really mean anything. Or I couldn't resist this. This is Disney, pure Disney, more nonsense language used in charms. Then we have this problem where herbal magic can be combined with religious belief, and it's just, there's a lot of overlap. Herbs and ointments were often compounded with holy water, which has been blessed by a priest. So it's hard to distinguish between its function as holy and its role as water. Popular and monastic manuals for healing often encourage their readers to say prayers over herbs. So herbs by themselves are apparently not bad, but you have to pray over them. You can't have sort of strange invocations. Magical charms also incorporate famous religious texts, familiar religious texts. The Magnificat, as we saw in birth girdles, also the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and the Hail Mary. Sometimes the origins of charms are even attributed to saints, and medieval physicians also used charms to aid in healing. There were no clear boundaries, in other words. Exorcism was also practiced by the church until fairly recently. I know it was practiced through the 20th century. I'm not sure about recently. Maybe you guys know. But lay people could also practice exorcism, and this is described in Kieckhefer from about page 73. Then Kieckhefer describes another element in which the action of the sympathetic magic is explained in the charm itself. So that's unusual, but it happens. So a pregnant woman who fears miscarriage or misshapen offspring, or even the death of a child, of a fetus, is instructed to step 3 times over a grave. And the charm actually incorporates what that meaning is as she's doing it. She is supposed to say, with her first step, "This as my help against the evil late birth." And then the stepping across again. This as my help against the grievous dismal birth. And then stepping over again. This as my help against the evil lame birth. Finally, he says in this section that people might believe that verbal formulas had inherent power, but they can always distinguish between charms and prayers. Hard to tell sometimes. And they didn't really care for the most part, unless they were very vociferous churchmen. If the charms worked, that's pretty much all that mattered. Okay, now we move to amulets and talismans, and these were mainly used for protection. Here, Kieckhefer talks about that Sator Arepo magic square that I discussed earlier, along with other types of talismanic use. Okay, so here's a rabbit's foot. You can buy this online if you feel so moved. This may be causing all the vegetarians in the room to shudder. Here's the charm. A hare's foot bound to the left arm will enable a person to go anywhere without danger. That's very old, that idea of the rabbit's foot. Others are sprigs of rosemary put in a person's door will keep venomous snakes away. Carried on one's person, rosemary keeps evil spirits at bay, and a spoon made of rosemary wood has power against poison. Heliotrope, gathered under the sign of Virgo and wrapped in laurel leaves, along with the tooth of a wolf. Not sure quite where you get that, but will keep people from saying anything bad about its bearer. So if you don't want people to say bad things about you, you need to get heliotrope, gathered under the sign of Virgo and wrapped in laurel leaves around the tooth of a wolf and carry it around with you. Well, the church also used some of this. They believed, for example, that you could ring church bells, that ringing church bells would ward off evil or danger. And people carried relics of the saints into battle, or a piece of the true cross, of which there are many. Here's supposedly the largest piece of the true cross, but there are so many pieces of the true cross in churches around the world that the true cross would probably be the size of the Empire State Building. The Eucharist in the Mass also took on magical properties, and this is when the bread, the wafer, is raised. It represents or is the body of Christ, depending on the Christian belief system one subscribes to. It is the body of Christ, certainly for medieval people. This notion that it's just a symbol comes in later with Protestantism. Anyway, the Eucharist also was seen as magical. It was believed that a person who simply saw the host being raised at the altar would be safe from harm that whole day. People also used the host as charms by writing spells or Bible verses on it, a form of improper usage of the sacred object based on superstition. Kieckhefer also talks about a woman who buries the host in her garden. I think it's Kieckhefer. And her garden grows particularly fine cabbages, but she's condemned by the church, I think fined, for misusing the host, the body of Christ, for this purpose. We know about sorcery, a related subject, or the misuse of medical and protective magic to turn against enemies or make them sick or do bad things to them, mainly from court cases. Charms used with evil intent were used as curses. Okay, so evil intention. Magic has a lot to do with intention. If your intention is benevolent, kind, good, fair, pretty acceptable, not entirely acceptable by churchmen, but if your intention is evil, that's a whole other ballgame. Okay, now stories were told of how a woman might kiss a man while holding the host in her mouth to increase his love for her. No, that's not so good. I mean, that's not terrible, but in one famous case, a woman who did this was punished with the inability to see the consecrated host even when it was elevated during the Mass. Only when she touched a relic of St. Bridget of Sweden was she released from this affliction. Okay. I kind of wonder about this. I know a fair amount about St. Bridget of Sweden. Is St. Bridget of Sweden? Yes, it is. St. Bridget was an interesting saint. She was a mom. She had, I think, 10, 12, 14 children, after which she started having daily visions of the Virgin. And when her husband died, she started her own religious order. And she wanted her own separate religious order. Ultimately, she was forced by the church to base her role, I think, on the Augustinian rule. But she wanted her own separate religious order, and she fought with the Pope about it. And she predicted that the Pope would because he refused her own order, that his teeth would fall out and he would die, which is exactly what happened, according to historical accounts. I wouldn't have messed with her. Okay, and then there are other types of love magic or aphrodisiacs. To arouse a woman's lust, says Kieckhefer, one manuscript advises soaking wool in the blood of a bat and putting it under her head while she is sleeping. The testicles of a stag or a bull or the tail of a fox will arouse a woman to sexual desire. Not sure what you're supposed to do with that. Putting ants' eggs in her bath will arouse her so violently that willy-nilly she will seek intercourse. Ugh. Then there is this manual that instructs the would-be lover to carve, quote, Pax Pix Sabira Sith Samasik, unquote, on a hazel stick, and hit a woman on the head with it 3 times, then immediately kiss her, and you will be assured of her love. Somehow I don't think that one works. A woman, on the other hand, can arouse her husband to love by mixing an herb with earthworms and giving it to him in his food. Ugh. Then there are whole treatises concerning cures for male impotence, which you can read about in Kieckhefer. Now we move on to telling the future. Dream interpretation was very popular long before Sigmund Freud as predictive of the future. Chaucer and a few other writers discuss types of dreams, one arising from indigestion, but others showing true future outcomes. And Scipio Africanus, here shown, was a great Roman general who wrote down his dreams and was regarded as a visionary. He apparently had prophetic dreams, which were commented on a lot in the Middle Ages. What's this doing here? Okay. Then we have popular astrology, which continues from the classical era through scientific astrology, based on the direct observation of the heavens, which becomes important in the 12th century. There are also lucky and unlucky days, which could be predicted through one's astrological chart. Of the unlucky days, one Leech book or medical book says this: whoever weds a wife on any of these days, the unlucky days, he shall not long have joy of her. And whoever undertakes any great journey shall never come back again, or some misfortune shall befall him. And he that begins any great work shall never make an end thereof. And he that has his blood let shall soon die, or never be well. Bibliomancy, or the practice of opening a book, usually a Bible, at random and reading a passage and interpreting it as predicting the future or commenting on the current situation, was a medieval practice that is still used today. People would ask questions, then roll dice, the numbers predicting the outcome. Kieckhefer then discusses the use of herbs and other means to find out if someone is lying or stealing, but I'm jumping ahead to his discussion of the notebook of Thomas Bettson, who was a monk of Zion Abbey. Let me see if I have a picture of him. I don't. So they had one, but I had a woodcut of him. Thomas Bettson was a real guy. He was a monk at Zion Abbey, which is St. Bridget's Augustinian order. So this is St. Bridget of Sweden again, in England. So Bettson was English. St. Bridget's order was, there was a big order of hers that was popular in England, very powerful also, and engaged actually in that transition from manuscript to print, which is quite interesting. Anyway, Bettson liked to perform magic like magicians do today, and he kept a record of this. And Kieckhefer gives you a couple examples of the magic tricks that Bettson liked to do. He liked to make an egg seem like it was moving by itself. He'd have a hollowed out egg with the hair, fine hair of a woman, he says, and you could hang it in the house and people would think it was just hanging in thin air, floating in space. Or he suggests putting a beetle inside an apple with a hole in its center, and people would think that the apple moves by itself. So even in the Middle Ages, there were magician entertainers, as well as those who took magic more seriously. Now, the last picture here, the magician, is from the Italian Visconti tarot, which is a very interesting thing. It's 15th century. It's the earliest collection of tarot cards that we have. It's in the Morgan Library. And I put a film about this on our class site for you to watch. So with that, I will end. There will be a quiz on the 2 sections of this Kieckhefer lecture, these 2 lectures, coming up shortly. Bye for now. Oops.